Okay, and we are slowly gathering. Welcome to the webinar, Artificial Intelligence, Algorithmic Stereotyping and Young People, hosted by the partnership between the European Commission and the Council of Europe in the field of youth. We will just wait for a few moments to allow everybody to join. So this webinar will be recorded and it is also streamed live on Facebook. I invite everybody to use the chat function of the Zoom to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit more about who you are and why you're interested in this topic. You can also use the Q&A function of the Zoom to leave questions to our guests. And for those of you who are following us via Facebook Live, please feel free to write your questions or any feedback you might have in the comments section. We will be following Facebook as well, and we will be transferring some of your questions to our guests and speakers as well. So today's topic is hosted within the Perspectives on Youth series. And in the Perspectives of Youth, we basically discuss various topics and emerging themes relevant to the lives of young people. And these include not only artificial intelligence and digital tools, but also topics which relate to political participation and activism of young people, topics related to environment, climate crisis, but also solidarity, social inclusion, and anything new that comes up that is on the radar and that is of interest and relevance to young people. So this webinar today is basically stemming from our work on social inclusion and digitalization. And our guests, Dan McQuillan and Salaj, have written a chapter on this topic for the upcoming Youth Knowledge book on social inclusion and digitalization. And we invited them to share a little bit more about this topic, to introduce artificial intelligence, algorithms, and the stereotypes behind it to the wider audiences. What our work has shown so far, both on the study of social inclusion and digitalization, but also other research, is that there are great inequalities when it comes to both access as well as use of technology and digital tools. And the development of digital technology is no different. And Ron and Dan are going to speak to us a little bit today about how these social inequalities are then transferred into the digital realm. We will also explore some of the questions regarding the myth of objectivity of artificial intelligence, as well as the stereotyping of artificial intelligence, how it impacts young people's lives, but also what can be done to regulate artificial intelligence. So without further ado, I hand over to Ron, who is going to introduce the topic of inequalities, and then Dan will take over further on artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Lana. Can you hear me? Good. I think this is the most used introduction. Can you hear me in Zoom webinars and meetings? So let me try to share the screen, which is the second most used introduction. Can you see my screen now? Good. Thanks very much for the invitation, and also everyone else for joining. So really, as you said, I'm gonna provide a very brief introduction to what is more extensive written on the chapter, Precarious Youth and the Spectre of Algorithmic Stereotyping. We will not have time to go much in the details and discuss a bit more in detail the doubts, the questions, and the critique we raise on the chapter. However, I'm going to try actually to provide some of the main body of work that we have written, and also provide examples in order to illustrate the content of that chapter. I will also say that I will not actually explain what AI is, so that will not get from me, and Dan is gonna speak a bit more on that. However, I will actually speak a bit more for wider themes of relationships between AI, young people, and the society itself. And the way how I'm going to do it is through four main provocations. Now, to me, why this for provocation? Because for me, provocation is also something that, it inspires, encourages curiosity, encourages discussion, encourages learning, and also it provokes something to invent a new thing, to invent perhaps something unimaginable before, and something that might open up new spaces and new horizons. I will therefore start with the first provocation, which I called it as, "Oh my body, make me always a man who questions." And basically, those who have read Frantz Fanon, his great book, Black Skin, White Mask, this is the last prayer that he closes the book. And it's basically the lived experience of a Black man in Europe. And in that spirit, in the Fanon spirit, I'm gonna explain a little bit what is the lived experience in the era of where the narrative of digital technology and entrepreneurship has made it for us. And I'm going to question the very core elements upon which this narrative has been constructed and promoted as well. The second provocation, which sounds a bit more fatalist, act as if you were not free. It's basically, I'm gonna try and I'm gonna attempt to problematize the whole notion of freedom as promoted by the narrative of digital innovation and technological entrepreneurship. Namely, the freedom of choice, the freedom to work from anywhere, the freedom to change the jobs at any time, the freedom to follow one's own passions, and so on and so on. We're going to look also a bit more on phenomena of gig economy, which is the new type of economy heavily relied on artificial intelligence technologies, such as Airbnb, Uber, delivery, and so on and so forth. And third and the fourth provocations are slightly a bit more theoretical. However, I made sure to include examples which might not make very boring. The third one, act as if you did not exist. Seriality draws from French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of seriality. And we're gonna look how for algorithm, the human subjects are nothing more or less than statistical numbers. So somehow subjects are reduced into numbers and then optimized through machine learnings for algorithmic training and other stuff. And the provocation number 4, I would prefer not to, draws from the theory of interpassivity, which basically was notioned by Fowler in 1996, and it looks at basically a state of passivity in the presence of potential activity, and how this sort of state of passivity is reinforced and strengthened by the entire AI-run technologies. So, provocation number 1, the narrative of digital innovation and technological entrepreneurship. Now, it's interesting when we look at the narrative of digital innovation and technological entrepreneurship, which more or less have started by 90s, but around 2010 has taken the entire new form and has taken a massive promotion. So if you look at this narrative, one of the sort of main messages that we receive and which has been sort of elevated are that this sort of digital innovation and technological entrepreneurship sort of, free individual talent, create new jobs, create new opportunities, create new economies. We just mentioned gig economy, and sort of creates also new myths, okay? And in part, this is true. I mean, we could see sort of, individual talent coming up. We could see also new jobs like no one would imagine. For example, 20 years ago, someone would work from anywhere as a social media manager for a company located somewhere else, or the number of graphic designers, the number of software developers, the number of content moderators that do a massive job for social networks. And these are all new jobs and new economies that have been sort of created. However, the role of narrative is to actually totalize and dominate the audience. And if you look, for example, how this narrative was constructed is in a way that it sort of appeals as a primary audience to young people. We could hear, for example, words like, or, you know, these became like the buzzwords of the narrative: technology, social networks, startups, artificial intelligence, big data, participation, interactivity, 3D, and so on and so on. And these were some of the key words, key messages that constituted this narrative. But in order for narrative to really appeal to its audience, it needed its own story. So the story, which actually is done by the characters inside. And we could see the characters of this narrative, you know, from Bill Gates to Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, Musk, Sergey Brin, and so on and so forth. And what actually is interesting is that in itself, the narrative having this sort of dominating tendency, it actually tries to create the myth in order to survive for a long time. And it's interesting, for example, how these narratives have something very much in common. So if you look if you go and search about the gentlemen on the picture online, and you will see that something that makes them in common, apart from being in the same industry, more or less, it's that they all somehow ended up in garages of their rented homes, rented apartments, or garages of their parents' house, to basically co-fund and start up their own sort of big companies. And now, you know, the myth creation is something very interesting, because and one who wrote a lot about myth creation was radical educator Paulo Freire. And in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I'm gonna cite him. He sees how the myth creation has kept the poor classes in South America, mainly peasants, in their own inferior positions. And what he calls about is for decoding of reality in systematic way. And decoding, according to him, is nothing else than a description of the situation in the context of the perceived conditions and the way in which these are shaped by the social structures. Now, what we try to do is also a bit really decoding exercise, decoding what this narrative has inside. If you look, for example, you know, and if you go and read a bit more on language, on semiotics, and the science which actually studies the language and the narrative constructions, you know, in this narrative, you could identify two main elements. The one is signifiers, and which is, you know, those who give the bold meaning to the narrative. And we could see, for example, Amazon, Garage, and Bezos, which are the main signifiers of this narrative. So these young people who built these amazing companies in garages, and that's what actually totalizes the attention of the audience. But on the other hand, what we don't actually put the focus on, it's the access to which is inside this narrative. For example, and I'm gonna speak a bit more in a few minutes about the access, because that's something where the decoding happens. But just to mention that the myth that we see here, you know, these young men who built these companies, I think it's problematic at two levels. So firstly, at the level of ethno-cultural particularities, so where basically it advances the dominant role of white men. And the second level, which I find it problematic as well. It's basically the economic equality. It reproduces social inequality and social reproduction as well. So we discuss a bit the signifiers of the narrative of the digital innovation and technological entrepreneurship. And if we can sum up, we can see it how this narrative inside has something that we need to decode, something which tells us it's wrong about it. And that is what I call the excess of the narrative. And if you look again back here, and if you read the entire sentence, it goes like, Amazon was founded in garages of Bezos' rented home in Washington. Page and Brain started Google in garages rented by them, along with three other rooms, while they were living at the dorms of Stanford University, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting that the access, I think we can identify three more accesses here. The first one is access to elite education. And basically, most of these people have studied on the elite education, Harvard University, Stanford University, Princeton University, and so on and so forth. Now, the question I think that we should raise is this: do all young people have access to such an education? Is that type of education accessible to all young people? Is that education accessible particularly for underprivileged, marginalized young people who have no access to that type of education? So the other question is, do all young people actually have enough time to innovate in garages and have that privilege to innovate in the garages? So these are questions which I think brings us to the second access, which is that access to the seed funding. And this is also interesting because in order to start up a project idea, a company, an entrepreneurship project, or whatever it is, you nevertheless need some sort of resources, some money. You need to pay at the very least, if nothing else, you need to pay, to rent the garage, you need to pay to rent an apartment, a space, some equipments for the office, other expenditures, and so on and so forth. And what is interesting is that what the narrative doesn't say is that where this seed funding, where is this pool of resources being available for people who have co-founded this. For example, two co-founders of the Google, Brain and Page, they both received a big funding by National Security Agency on 98, 99, while they were studying at Stanford, because that was something that for state security, it looked like an interesting idea, because you have somehow you were pioneering the monopolization of data, and they could see that as interesting for the state security, and that's why they decided to fund. And today we have Google, which is the biggest sort of companies on Google search engine advertisement, and what else. And for example, many of them also had access to families' resources, so they were coming from in well-being state families, where, for example, they could lend money from parents, or they could have access to a wide range of influential people and networks that would help you to access funding. So I think if it's naive, and if we look, for example, and we connect it to the broader spectrum of our life, I think would be very difficult to see how this would happen in countries with poor economic indicators, with countries where neo-colonialism, but also the history of colonial past have been deep-rooted inside the social inequalities. So if we just move a bit outside of our sort of privileged cupola, we could see, for example, how things get very difficult to innovate for majority part of the young people. And the third axis I want to look, it's ethno-cultural particularities. And this is interesting because this is also a symptomatic in a way that that how it's possible that biggest tech companies belong to, you know, white men, and this raises also another question, which is basically, do I have to belong to another ethno-cultural particularity in order to actually have this possibility to have access to elite education, to have access to seed funding, and so on and so forth. So I think that this sort of, that the last one, which is access, but it's also a symptom, explains also how centuries old oppressive structures are reproduced so purely and so well inside some of the most modern environments of the working environments today. I think that these oppressive structures we can see at three ways. The first one is economic inequality. The second one is lack of women's access to privileges and power. And the third one is neo-colonial practices. Now, if you look, for example, at the second one, lack of women's access to privileges and power, which is actually connected with the, you know, the dominant role of the white man. However, the narrative has tried to sort of fix its own image. For example, we could see this at the campaign and the book written by Sheryl Sandberg, the director of Facebook, where she was calling for lean-in feminism, where she would, the main thesis was basically, you know, all the women should get into work. I'm horribly simplifying it, should get into a multinational corporation, and then they would sort of, you know, take the strong positions over there, and that's why speak for themselves. However, this was heavily opposed by Feminism for the 99%, a collective group which actually was calling for how women should be seen and represented not from the top of the society, but it must start with those at the bottom and fight for the work they deserve. So we could see how this narrative sort of confronted with some of the oppressive structures that it reproduced, it started to sort of fix them. However, they nevertheless remain again valid. Now, I think because when we wrote this chapter, the COVID situation was not so it was, let's say, it was a specter of COVID coming from China, but the COVID was not here yet in Europe, in the United States, and in other parts of the world. And this is interesting because COVID-19 has shown also some of these problematics. It just made them, you know, appear on the surface. We could see, for example, now how difficult it is for families who are now locked at home in small apartments, and they have limited resources for internet connections. Just to remind that to use internet, it still costs money. So you need to pay a monthly fee for internet connection in almost all the countries. And actually, you actually need actually to have the devices, the digital devices like tablets, laptops, and so on and so forth. Now, what we have seen with the COVID is that, you know, a family who has, you know, a small apartment and one computer, and they are asked to work from home. You know, that is, how do you deal with that? You know, and if you also have kids, then they are asked to follow the lectures or study online. So you have somehow to manage to share one laptop that you might have and perhaps a poor broadband connection to work and to give opportunity to your kids to learn. So again, this inequality, it appears another time in the pure form. Now, the provocation too, it sort of looks a bit to the question of freedom. Freedom. And one might ask, how does this relate to young people, and how does this relate to particularly to vulnerable communities or individuals? So the main message that we received also from the narrative that I just explained is that, you know, Zuckerberg did it in the dormitory room, Bezos did it in garage, that one did it in garage, so you are the next one to do it. And if you cannot make it, it's your fault because they did it, but you cannot make it. So it somehow put all the burden into individual shoulder of the one's person. And basically, we can enter to discuss a bit more here all the systematic and structures of inequality and so on and so forth. However, I think here I can briefly make 4 points. The first one is how this sort of narrative has developed a culture of precarious work and fragmentation of the working contract. Now, this freedom, basically, which sort of, you know, you can work from anywhere, you can choose your working schedule at any time, and so on and so forth. It basically just first encouraged the precarious work, and then what the precarious work does as a consequence, it fragmentizes the working contract. And the second bit is technology, AI-run technologies vis-a-vis employment. This sort of implicated this culture, so the culture of precarious work and fragmentation of the contract is also related heavily to the technology and employment. We could see, for example, how Amazon uses the wristband to monitors, you know, the efficiency of the workers in the track warehouses. They know exactly how many minutes they spent in the toilet, how many minutes they spent in the packaging line, how many minutes they spent up standing, and so on and so forth. In order to survive as a precarious worker, you are solely dependent on the number of contracts and clients you can insure. And this is also another problematic thing. If you are a precarious worker, you also need to make, you know, as many delivery as possible in order to ensure some income. If you are working for example, as a content moderator, you need to moderate as many content as possible in order to receive the money. And this is a great book called Ghost Work by Mary Gray and Sidney Suri, where they actually speak about this phenomenal work of the ghost workers, so the workers that we don't see and which are located mainly in the periphery of the capital, let's call it. And what the ghost workers do, it's actually, let's say, for example, all the content that we report as hate speech, as pornography, as heavily related content. This content, these reports go to people who actually look for 8-12 hours, and then they make a decision whether to remove it or not based on the guidelines of the Facebook or another social network. And so for 10-12 hours, they are actually, you know, exposed to very heavy content, to very heavy material. And a number of studies have shown that many of them suffer from various psychopathological diseases. But the other thing that the ghost worker do, and not only, but actually all of us, it's free labor. Now, for algorithm to work well, it needs to be trained, okay? And how the algorithm train, and then we're gonna explain a bit better, it needs data to feed in. So more data the algorithm receives, it gets well trained, and better it is trained, then it more sufficiently function, which we will see that it's not completely true. And if you have seen, for example, it was, I think, last year, an example with this mobile app called age boothing, where you could take a selfie of yourself and then you would just turn your face into a 90-year-old person, and then you would publish it or share with your friends. It was massively, massively used by anyone, and people were laughing on this, you know, how I look now I'm 90 years old. But what the meaning of that app is basically is nothing else rather than facial recognition training for artificial intelligence. And we all performed this sort of labor for free for the owners of aging booth. Now, for the company who had the aging booth, the application itself was not something that they were caring a lot. What they were caring is the data that were coming in, because with all the faces they could receive, they could train that AI facial recognition, and then they could develop new types of softwares, facial recognition softwares that they could sell to states, to governments, to private companies, and to other people. Now, another thing that the notion of freedom is problematic is sort of this sort of, you know, I mentioned a bit briefly before how we kind of are told that, you know, setting up your working schedule, you know, setting up your working days, working from anywhere, you know, this nomadism, following, changing the work anytime wants, it's absolutely phenomenal. And I guess, you know, working from the beach, I guess it's exciting as well. However, one thing I actually noticed also, and many psychologists are talking about, is how working online in itself, it's an auto-exploitation. And it's a great critical theorist, Byung-Chul Han, who basically wrote some great books, you know, The Burnout Society, Topology of Violence, and so on and so forth. And, you know, it became known, he became now known in the media because the stuff he was written before are now becoming very relevant with the COVID-19. And we could see how people are tired from Zoom meetings, how people are tired to organizing the work online. And one of the things that Han writes in his book, The Burnout Society, is that, you know, the people, you know, the individuals who work, you know, online, they are often auto-exploiters. They exploit themselves. They are slaves of themselves. And because some of the elements that he has researched are that the people who work online, they try to be over attentive, they try to be over efficient, they try to be over productive, just to show that, you know, they are not sort of faking their work, but they are actually doing a real work. And this is, for example, something that was very much identified in some of the Silicon Valley companies, where, you know, working inside, it's a great freedom, because you can work at any time, you can take a coffee at any time, you can play table tennis at any time. And actually, one of the companies, they actually had the policy that you could take a holiday at any time. But what was interesting, that people, just to show that they are not misusing this opportunity to take holidays at any time, they were not taking holidays at all. They wanted to work. So we could then, you know, discuss a bit further at the psychological level, the question of, you know, when you have something that is offered to you and you don't take it, but something that is not offered to you, you want it. That's something that Lacan called petit object A, but we don't have time here as well. Just to conclude on this provocation very quickly, is that at the gig economy, which is basically the new type of economy, which is heavily relied on AI technologies, like Uber controls all their sort of workers through an application. Delivery does the same. So except that they foster precarious work, fragmentation of the working contract, the culture of continuous surviving and competition. Another element that I actually noticed is this sort of, I call meta exploitation. So what does it mean? Like, even to participate in the gig economy, for example, to be able to rent an apartment at Airbnb, you still need to own an apartment. To work for Uber, you still need a car to actually go and work as an Uber taxi driver. And what we see here, you as a precarious worker, living or surviving on Airbnb, renting apartments, then what happens is that you actually end up hiring some other people to clean up your apartments very quickly, because the next one is arriving in an hour. So you exploit it or exploiting the other. So this is sort of a meta exploitation process that sort of undertakes within the gig economy. Now, I will now take a bit more. I'm just checking the hour. Yes, so very quickly, I will move on a bit to last two provocations. I mentioned before the seriality, and Jean-Paul Sartre in his sort of notable book, Critique of Dialectical Reason, in one of the chapters, he speaks about seriality. And basically for Sartre, seriality is nothing else rather than a plurality of isolations. And he takes an example of people waiting at the bus queue. So these people are basically, are together orienting themselves towards an object, entering into the bus, and they don't have some sort of communication. And the connection between them is very loose and very superficial. And what Sartre basically says, the opposite of seriality is the group who is actively and meaningfully engaged with each other. So what we see with artificial intelligence is precisely a new form of seriality, where human subjects are turned into statistical numbers optimized by machine learnings and data to make the machine works. Actually, I think when looking at artificial intelligence seriality, we can look at numerous ways. But for example, if we see, for example, how most of the social networks function, it's by serializing us into clusters of group, what we call filter bubbles, hashtags, tags, and so on and so forth. And just to give you an example, let's say, for example, I just read somewhere on the web an article on HIV, and then I went then to search another article for HIV, and then I watched the YouTube on HIV because I was interested to learn a bit more. And then when I go back to Facebook, I see an advertisement proposing me, drugs on HIV, stereotyping, prejudicing my sort of well-being, just because they could kind of connect they could link my interactivity on the web, and therefore just put me on the cluster of potential customers on HIV drugs. But seriality is a problematic also when you speak about democracy. And we could see, for example, a classical example is Cambridge Analytica scandal, where 87 million Facebook user profiles have been accessed by a company who then own this large, massive data, and then it just profilized and serialized, these users with micro-targeting advertisements in order to win elections for certain political parties, but also to manipulate them through psychographical content, like discouraging voting, changing the voting behaviors, and so on and so forth. Another problem, very briefly, I will mention, is AI facial recognition. And this is quite problematic because the way that AI is designed in its own, it's quite problematic, because it's a great research study by Joy Bolmini, who is who actually formed also a company on AI for Good, and she actually did a research on how the largest tech giants like IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, they all had racial biased AI because their facial recognition AI were trained by white people, light-skinned people, and where she tested about putting the face of Obama or Serena Williams in front of this type of AI, they could not recognize the face, although they were quite famous people, but just because of the dark skin color. The last bit I will conclude with, which it's interpassivity. And interpassivity, it's an interesting sort of phenomena. It's I think as Fowler with his own words said, it's one of the most widespread phenomena, but yet mostly an unknowledged form of cultural behavior. And what he calls interpassivity is basically it's rather than letting others work in your place, interpassive behaviors entails letting others consume in your place. And let's take, for example, some examples just to illustrate to you what interpassivity is. For example, when we watch Netflix, you know, we open Netflix and the first thing is, you know, we ask or we look for Netflix to suggest stuff to us, okay? And Spotify, we actually delegate or sort of work to Spotify to search the best playlist for us. And interpassivity is actually, you know, a state of potential activity, but you still remain passive. And we could see this, for example, in 2012 with the famous Kony 2012 campaign, you know, where we could see this, you know, very emotional, appealing movie. And, you know, we were touched upon this. And we were completely turned into interpassive subjects where we could donate something to the campaign, hoping that, you know, they will solve the whole problem of child soldiers in Uganda. But I think that interpassivity, it's actually, it's sort of perfectly explained well by an experiment that Zeynep Tufekci made with YouTube. One day where she was, you know, just looking at some sort of recipes on YouTube, and it left it in auto play. The YouTube started to provide more and more vegan food. And then she saw something not really wrong with it. And then she went on, and then she put it on jogging, and then YouTube was always trying to propose a triathlon and get more hardcore and hardcore. And then she turned the topic into politics, and she started to put some videos on Second World War, and the YouTube was suggesting always content from the far right movements. And that's why she called this YouTube the great radicalizer. So much of these AIs behind these technologies, they actually have a massive influence on our sort of looking and changing our behaviors and radicalizing them. And the last bit with which I want to conclude, and this is basically on what is a reflection on what is happening today with the COVID-19. I was reading something about, you know, how this sort of security, particularly on traveling, is going to be regulated when once, you know, air flights is going to take on. And they were sort of saying about how these sort of guidelines proposed by aviation regulatory agencies are proposing a complete contactless payment, touchless check-in, self-drop baggage, biometric passports, ultraviolet disinfection, thermal tunnels, and what else. So we are entering in this sort of field of biosecurity and surveillance under the skin, really. If 9/11 sort of, you know, started this sort of the surveillance above the skin massively, I think with the COVID-19, unfortunately, and here we should be very careful, we are entering into the era of surveillance under the skin. I think that, you know, often the COVID-19 is sort of portrified as some sort of, you know, light apocalypse. But I think in the Greek meaning of the word apocalypse is, you know, something to uncover, to unreveal, and to disclose. And what we are seeing here that with the COVID-19 is that, you know, some of the practices that we know are just being regulated or are advocated for being regulated in our society. So I'm sorry for going a bit longer than expected, but yeah, I will close it here and then taking over the questions, if any.
Okay, thank you so much, Ron. It was very interesting, and I think to link to what you were saying, besides for us maybe being able to trick technology into thinking that we are exercise-obsessed vegans, there's also that other side of radicalization, and EU Observer actually raised this point yesterday of right-wing radicalization linked with the algorithms in Europe. And I think many of our viewers are also very interested in this topic of how artificial intelligence works also when it comes to the current crisis and how it has been used. But I think for many of us as well, there is this question of what exactly is it and how does it work? So I give a floor to Dan to actually explain the algorithms.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, good. So I'm just going to share my screen and I'm going to try to explain AI in 10 minutes. Actually, I'm going to try and explain AI and some of the social consequences of AI in 10 minutes. So I'm sure that'll be fine. Let me just share my slide. So I'm hoping what you can see now is a screen that says, what is AI? And underneath it says AI equals ML. Okay. So AI is machine learning. There is no sci-fi, there's no super intelligent machines, but what AI really is and what does it mean for, well, all of us, isn't really very clear yet. And it's not even clear to the people who design these things, and definitely to the people who use them. So I'm going to try and explore a little bit what AI does as a way of trying to find out or explore together what the consequences are. And one of the things I'd like to do in that is ask you a few questions as I go. So I will ask a few, three or four questions just to give you a moment to think about what the issues might be that are raised by this. So firstly, AI is trained on data. It's very different to old style computing. Okay, old style computing, pre-AI, pre-machine learning, you gave it a set of rules and then it did some calculations and it came up with an answer. With AI, you give it the answers and it develops its own idea of what the rules are. So actually, it's a big change. So when you're teaching it to recognize dogs or cats, you don't give it a set of rules about how do dogs' noses look, how do cats' ears look. You show it lots of pictures of dogs and cats, and that will enable the machine learning to figure out its own rules for telling the difference between dogs and cats. But one thing I'd really like to ask you is, what does that mean when it comes to social data? What does it mean for society that we have something that learns by being shown examples?
We can say also that everybody's welcome to use the chat function to answer some of the questions that Dan is raising.
Yeah, please, I'm so sorry. Yeah, please feel free to type anything in the chat. Okay, what we've got are machines that are being trained on being shown examples. We're now applying them to ourselves, to society. So we're trying to get them to come up with rules by showing them examples. This has some immediate consequences, which I think probably everybody here is already familiar with. Okay. So those consequences really are, broadly speaking, bias. If we show it lots of examples from society, it's going to come, the learning the machine does is going to come from within society. So it's going to come with the visible or invisible patterns that are already established in society. And since we don't live in a utopia, or even in a very equal society, that's going to come along with a lot of the social consequences that Ron has already talked about. What does it mean anyway, machine learning? How is it actually learning these things? And I think that's really important to understand, because machine learning, particularly in its guise of AI, but even when you say machine learning, sounds like something quite human, or something intelligent in the sense that we understand other beings to be intelligent. And I just want to show you what AI basically is. This is AI. I'm hoping that you can see these two animated graphs. The top graph just shows something that a lot of us would have done at school. You have a set of points, you want to fit a straight line. So what you do is you start off with a guess, you figure out how far each point is from the line, you try to minimize that difference. You add up all the distances from all the points to the line, and then you change your line so that it gets a bit, so that that total gap becomes smaller. You minimize the gap, you minimize the overall distance. And that's what the bottom graph shows. It shows that total difference between your guess and the actual data. And that's what AI is doing. It's calculating a distance, a difference between its guess, its prediction, and its data. So you train it the way Ron described. You give it loads of examples, you train it on lots of labeled data, and then it figures out, by minimizing this mathematical number, how to get the best fit to that data. So obviously it's a bit more complicated in some of the details, but this is essentially and in essence what AI is doing. It's learning by minimizing a mathematical difference. That's why computers can do it, because that's what computers are good at. They're good at maths. In fact, what they're good at in this case is essentially statistical pattern finding. Okay, so your AI, your machine learning, is putting new input into boxes based on what it recognizes from the training input, from the training data. So it learns the differences between cat and dog. It's not statistics that you might have learned at school. It's not interested in robustness and error. Sorry, I'm including that on my screen. It's not interested in finding errors. It's interested in making predictions. So it's not exactly statistics, but it's using statistical pattern finding. So this is what it's able to do: distinguish between two sets of data. These could be good and bad job candidates. They could be cancer scans, whichever it is. This is, this is what the machine learning can do, is find a boundary between these different things using statistical methods. But what does that mean when it's applied to people? Okay. If you think about this statistical categorization, what happens when it's applied to human beings? What would be the definition of a statistical method applied to people like this?
Maybe then we can also reflect here with this question on the example that is included certainly in the chapter of the knowledge book regarding the use of these data and statistics basically within the social services in some countries. And how does this impact then on inequalities, not only of young people, but also the population in general?
Exactly. What we've got here is essentially machinic stereotyping. Right? Every prediction about somebody, and in particular about somebody's future, because that's really where machine learning and AI offer something new, is predictions of the future. And it's just important to remember that all of these predictions about the future are based on what people, if we're talking about people, what people like you have done in the past, what people like them have done in the past. So it's very much, it's not simply in the data that the bias comes, it's in the stereotyping activity. It puts people into boxes and predicts their future behavior in the same way that Facebook picks up ethnic affinity as an advertising category without ever asking people anything about their ethnicity. So people who've reflected on this in terms of algorithms in general, not just machine learning, when it's applied in social settings, such as Virginia Eubanks in her book, Automating Inequality, have discovered concerning qualities of this activity, particularly that it tends to increase inequality, even when well-intentioned. In other words, even when the people, as far as you can tell, and she spent a lot of time around actual practitioners, even when the people concerned are trying to do the right thing, this can essentially make things worse. And there are at least a couple of reasons for that. One is it tends to get applied to people about who there's more data, and that tends to be people who are already, at the attention of services, maybe seen as problematic in some way. So more and more of this statistical sorting is applied to them and not the people who are already have less problems. And the second thing is unintended consequences. If you optimize, if you minimize on a single quality, if you want to get as many people to stay, to house as many homeless people as possible for a longest time as possible, you might end up only helping the good homeless people, the ones who will stay in a new house, and not the more problematic ones. So you've got a couple of reasons why she says, quite rightly, I think, that it's automating inequality. So machine learning itself, problematic. And I'm just very quickly going to cover what most people now think of as AI, which is really neural networks. So neural networks are, they don't really look like anything, they're just maths, but these are a couple of examples. The top one is what's called fully connected layers in a neural network, and the bottom one is convolutional neural network that's mainly used for images. The impression I'd like you to take away from the top one is how highly connected these intermediary layers are. This is a filter with many, many, many interconnections. So when it figures out how to get from the start to the end, how to get from an image to an identification of a number in this case, there are many different small calculations in between, and it works very well. It's incredibly effective, but it then becomes very difficult to say, well, which of those bits in between is important? How did it discover that this was a number 9 or this was a dog? It becomes extremely difficult to reverse that to human reasoning because it's basically a massive number of complex calculations. Similarly, the bottom picture, the convolutional neural network, it abstracts from the original image, and then it abstracts and it filters and it abstracts. It abstracts information that helps it distinguish between things. But exactly what the significance of that information is in human terms, very difficult to say. So the question I would ask about the fact that this is difficult to reverse to human reasoning would be, what does this mean for decisions? And I'm just going to move across these questions right now so we can get to some real live questions. And what I'd say, my own answer to this would be that it introduces an inherent problem. We tend to work on the basis of due process, that everyone's decisions about people should be open and clear and transparent, and they should have a say. And this becomes much more difficult when the decision or even the recommendation has been made through a neural network. And even this can increase, I think there is some evidence, thoughtlessness. So you make a recommendation that such and such a family should have a visit from a social worker, that such and such a person should be stopped at the border. Why? Well, the machine can tell you that they should be, but it can't tell you why. That's essentially because all these machines are doing is correlation, right? They're telling you about the connections between the new data and the things that they learn from. It's connections and not causations. It doesn't understand the world. AI doesn't have any understanding. It doesn't even see things in the sense that we'd understand seeing. It's just a correlation machine. It finds mathematical connections. Okay, it's very effective, but that's all it's doing. So should we care? If it's making good predictions, if it's picking out the right family, if it's picking out the right situation to be concerned about, why should we care? And again, my rhetorical answer to that would be, there is a fundamental problem. If we mistake correlation for causation, we might attribute the wrong causes to things, and AI is designed for intervention. It's meant to tell us where to act. So there's a built-in danger here that we're going to end up acting on the wrong thing. The other thing, of course, is it doesn't always get it right. This is an example, not a very clear one perhaps, of adversarial machine learning. The pattern in this picture has been carefully altered so that the AI is now absolutely convinced that it's seeing a gun and not a turtle. And the changes are very small, they're subtle, and no 3-year-old would be fooled by these changes. We can all see that it's turtle, but you can fool the AI. And that's not because the AI is stupid, it's because the AI is mathematical and it's just working on these mathematical connections. And there are many, many simpler examples where it can come to entirely the wrong conclusion. And yet, when you look at the statistics from training, it could be 98.7% accurate. So overall, we've got some really powerful, amazing new methods that don't do anything to do with understanding. What they do is they make predictions for intervention. And we should ask, who does that work for? Okay, it tends to work very well when you're trying to optimize on a metric. If you've got a target in management or in business or in government, this can help you to optimize on that target. It can help with efficiencies, it can help with automation, and it can help with scale. The question for us in this seminar anyway is, what does that mean for young people in general, and particularly for young people who might be more marginalized and excluded? And that's why our paper tries to articulate why we should consider the idea of people's councils on AI for young people. In other words, young people themselves getting together to reinsert their own experiences, reinsert their own voices in a process which is overall very invisibilizing. Everything that Ron said, and I hope everything that I've said, really has this one overarching effect of making some really important things invisible. It makes labor invisible, it makes bias invisible, and at the end of the day, it makes us, and particularly the people who are most subject to it, invisible. And that's really what the idea of a democratic horizontal mechanism like people's councils is intended to do something about. We're happy to talk about that. And I just wanted to mention at the end, to echo Ron, that really everything that he said, everything that I've said, is going to be massively amplified in the post-COVID situation. AI deals with risk at scale. It's irresistible for states and institutions to make much more of AI, but all AI comes with, I believe, the problems that both he and I have discussed. So it will be very interesting to hear people's questions about that.
Thank you very much, Dan. It was really interesting, and even for those of us who might not be really proficient in the AI and what it does and how the algorithms are developed, I think the question of regulating artificial intelligence and regulating how it is used has been on the table for quite some time now. And I think with the current situation, it has emerged even more as one of the key questions as to who can use it, how to use it, as well as what the consequences are. I think both of your presentations have raised a number of questions, well, ethical and moral questions regarding the use of artificial intelligence and applying it to our lives. I will just briefly, because we are running out of time, I will briefly touch upon two of the questions that we have received. And one of them that we received over Facebook a couple of days ago relates to the use of artificial intelligence for education, basically, and the future of jobs for young people. So if you would like to reflect a little bit on that in terms of what is the potential, because we have spoken quite a lot about the perils or risks of artificial intelligence, but is there something good in the cards for us when it comes to algorithms?
I can offer an answer in relation to education, but it might not be the answer you want to hear. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a good thing. I'm sorry to say, I work in education. I'm a big fan of technology and also actually a fan of AI, but I think the way it's being used is in exactly the wrong way. And it is already being used in that second and negative way right now in education, in terms of automating it at scale based on metrics. And I really think that learning is about a relationship and a journey that is very difficult to capture in bare numbers. And the emphasis of obviously increasingly corporate and privatized education systems will be to focus on the bottom line, on those metrics, on those numbers, on those ratios of performance. And I do honestly think that that was already a great danger for education and has just been times by 100 since all education has suddenly been forced to pass through these same mechanisms that we're talking right now.
Thank you, Dan. We have also received some questions over Facebook regarding the learning behavior and invisible bias of artificial intelligence. But I will go to the question now, which was in the Q&A, which is for Ron, basically regarding the adapted ladder of participation that he has used. And how it has been adapted, and whether it is the one indeed from the Roger Hart, and how does it, how can it be adapted and used within this context?
Yeah, so I didn't have time to go much to the ladder of participation, which was obviously from Roger Hart. But when I was speaking about interpassivity, I was sort of trying to make a connection in the youth work, and where I would locate this state of active passivity in the, and I took the Roger Hart's ladder of participation, and for me, sort of, if you look, the tendency on big international organizations, a number of non-governmental organizations, public institutions like Ministry of Youth, municipality directorates on youth, and so on. When they speak about, youth participation, in many cases, at least from my experience on the countries that I could have the chance to look, see, and work with this, I could see that the young people were mainly sort of going through non-participation and tokenism, okay? And this was made possible, thanks also to many of the technologies today. Like, for example, I remember once when I had, a meeting at the ministry in Kosovo, where, they were speaking about involving these young people. And the only thing they could think is, yeah, let's set up, a survey online, just put it on Facebook, we receive, the data, and then we will design a policy. Okay, but what about young people who have no Facebook? What about young people who have no internet connection? What about young people who have no digital devices? But also, why not bring them in the room, in the table, and discuss about this, because somehow you put them in this state of interpassivity. You give them the illusion of participation, but keeping them as passive as possible. Okay, so in the state of potential activity, where they could come and express their concerns about the situation of unemployment, of education, of youth rights, you actually tell them, okay, you are active, you are interacting with you, but yet you are a passive. So that's sort of my connection with Roger Hart's ladder of participation.
Thank you, Ron. And to link to that, there is a question from Emilia Gagacin from the Advisory Council on Youth related to how do we imagine that people's councils work who organizes them, who moderates them, and where does their input go? And I will let Dan take that question.
Thanks very much. Yeah, well, it's a very general idea. So we don't have a simple template. And in actual fact, this is, it's such a radical idea in relation to how AI is currently designed or applied, that basically you could start pretty much anywhere. I would see people's councils or something like them having a role across the development process from the very beginning of an AI project through its development, but also as part of, what Lionel would probably call regulation, and I'd call sort of moderation, stabilization of its actual use. And the reason there being that what I tried to portray is a computation that has two primary effects. One is that it's essentially very simplifying. It's a complex simplification. It optimizes on a single goal, and that's very dangerous in a social setting unless it's balanced. So everywhere where this machine is being optimized, there has to be some kind of balance that says, actually, well, things, my experience, things are a bit more complicated. That has to be there, and at the moment it's completely eliminated. And the other reason is that the very power of these technologies, and they're not just powerful, they're also a lot of fun. They can do some incredibly interesting and creative things with these technologies, but they just seem so amazing that they have a disempowering effect. And in fact, they seem so authoritative that they take authority away from the voice of experience. And again, anywhere the voice of experience needs to be revalidated, needs to be back in the process, is where something like the People's Council should have a say. There is nothing like this in the process of the development of AI.
Thank you, Dan. There's also a question that follows up on that, which is from Christina from Youth Peace Ambassadors Network, which basically talks about how can we involve young people, and how can we involve also policymakers in the regulation of this technology when we have very few young people and policymakers who actually know how it works, who lack the basic AI literacy. And I think it's also the question then regarding the capacity building and how much is happening out there that we know nothing about.
Sure. Okay. Well, Ron may have an opinion. I'm just going to try a quick response to that, really, which is that the maths of AI, yes, it is. It can be quite complicated. The essence of what AI is doing, I think, can be made relatively accessible. It's what I'm trying to do. It might not have worked today, but I think it can be. But even better than that, there are more and more tools that are tools that you can kind of play with and experiment with and see how AI works. You can generate your own deep fakes. You can do creative things with AI. And I think it's important to experience how it works and also how it breaks and how it fails, to understand some of the limitations of the technique, to see how it can misidentify, a lorry as a rabbit or something like that. The experience of doing this and exploring it is much more accessible now. As we go on, as AI becomes, like every other technology, a bit more, of a consumer item, as it were, it's possible to take it and play with it. I don't believe in this kind of everybody needs to learn to code. I don't believe in that anyway. And I certainly don't believe everybody needs to learn how to math, do the maths of AI. That would be ridiculous. But I think this is a social technology, and all throughout our history, we've come up with ways of understanding. We didn't all learn about thermodynamics, but we know roughly what a steam engine does, roughly what a petrol engine does. Okay, we need to understand roughly what this stuff does, what its impacts are in society. And I think that's quite an accessible task, but we have to demystify it. And we have to have radically increased inclusion.
Great, thank you so much, Dan. Ron, you want to add on that, and maybe we can just follow up with the last question that you could perhaps link with as well from Marta in terms of the use of AI within the current pandemic, especially the way it has been used in Asia, and if there has been any impact that we have seen so far and implications on young people there. But you can start first with the People's Councils and
it's interesting how the the People's Councils on AI for Young People, it sort of takes attention. And I think myself and Dan can use this opportunity to invite everyone to sort of even, why not start some sort of idea to make it a reality. And we are very much looking forward to it. But, you know, I think what we should sort of say is that People's Councils on AI, it's not something that happened very quickly. It's a marathon thing. It can take years to do it. In 2014, myself, Dan, and a number of other people, friends and colleagues, we wanted to actually work in a completely new idea on something then sort of actually proposed to us on citizen science. So can we work an idea of democratizing science, particularly on air pollution? And then can we actually bring the science to the hands of the young people? Can we make science participatory? And in 2014, we started something we called Science for Change in Kosovo. And it took about 4 or 5 years to become now, you know, a kind of a small but yet meaningful movement of young people, which is led by them and working on, you know, investigating air pollution through scientific means, cheap scientific means, and actually driving mobilization and protesting against the air pollution. So I think something that comes as a proposal can really, with a partnership of number of people, of number of organizations, can really open up a new horizon unseen before. And why not? We really look forward also to hear what your proposals are, and perhaps start something. Now, I see there was a number of questions also on education, and I agree with Dan's sort of, you know, very skeptical view of education. Obviously, if I may put a little bit of nuance comment on this, obviously, nevertheless, you know, AI in education can provide, let's say, you know, this smart content for education, you know, more engagement with educational materials online, you know, the possibility of studying online, virtual mentoring, virtual coaching, education at any time, and so on. But the problem is that we can't predict AI, okay? And we have seen this numerous ways. For example, a Microsoft AI chatbot, which was launched to tweet some sort of stuff about Microsoft, all of a sudden started to tweet for pro-Nazi content, pro-racist content, you know? And you never know when that sort of happens and how it happens. And the problem is that if we really cannot have any possibility to do a physical education, is, you know, it should be heavily supervised by a teacher, by a professor, by a mentor, by a parent, and not leave solely to AI. And actually, the AI that is used for education actually should be fully transparent in the sense of, you know, who designed it, with what data designed it, who produced it, and how it's regulated behind it.
Thank you, Ron. I think artificial intelligence and this topic brings more questions than answers, at least at this stage. And the same is the case with our Q&A box here in the chat. And unfortunately, given the time, we won't be able to take all the questions. But we will certainly post the questions under the video on our Facebook Live, and anybody who would like to engage, including the two of you, are more than welcome to continue the debate there. So given that it's 20 past 12 already, I would like to thank you both very much for your time, for a very interesting presentation. As always, it has given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure all the participants of the webinar who have followed us today. I would like to also announce that related to the topic, not only of artificial intelligence, but also digitalization and social inclusion, we will be also presenting some of the platforms that young people might use in relation to social inclusion during the European Youth Event on 28th of May at 11:30, and everybody is welcome to join us for that as well. We will be having different speakers, but also nonetheless a very interesting topic. Thank you again for your time. I have really enjoyed it. It flew past, and I hope that the video will be available on our YouTube as well as on our website page, and I hope also that we will be able to share your presentation with those who have not been able to join us today. So thanks again, and have a lovely day, everyone.
Thank you.